You're listening to episode 320 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Sharon Su joins us to speak about her book, Occupy This Body, a Buddhist memoir. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Though many people may come from and live in the same lineage or branch of the Buddhist tree, what it means to us and how it may impact our life can be unique and very personal. What differences may exist when there's a supportive and loving family growing up, compared to when there is not, or perhaps even greater difficulties or trauma? How might Buddhism positively influence us in the face of not just dissatisfaction, but deep and sustained suffering during our formative years? Sharon A. Su is a professor of theology and religious studies at Seattle University. She earned her PhD in Buddhist Studies from Harvard University and is the author of Being Buddhist in a Christian World, Gender and Community, and Silver Screen Buddha, Buddhism in Asian and Western Film. In addition to her academic work, Sharon completed her 200-hour yoga teacher certification training, Transcending Sexual Trauma Through Yoga, Yoga for Trauma, and Level 1 certification in Mindful Eating, Conscious Living, through the UCSD Center for Mindfulness. She serves on the board of directors of Yoga Behind Bars, advocating for transformative justice and offering yoga for resilience and trauma recovery. A popular speaker on the topic of feminism and Buddhism, she's also developed and presented workshops on mindful movement, meditation, body image, body acceptance, and mindful eating practices. So sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon zinger tea. Our guest today is Sharon Su. Sharon, welcome to the podcast. Very glad to meet you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we have an interesting circumstance in which our topic for today really is about our guest. And so my usual question is having you tell us a little bit about your background. But we're going to go into detail on that as we talk about the book, which is a memoir of yours. But I would like you to say a bit about that background and kind of what the conditions were that you grew up with, because it's very pertinent to our conversation.
Sure, thanks. I grew up in Long Island, and I grew up in the 70s and was one of very few Asian American kids in my neighborhood, in my school. And my parents were first generation Korean immigrants. And so we grew up in this very white neighborhood. And I spent a good deal of time just being the only Asian American kid outside of my brother, and then maybe one or two others in my school. And so had this kind of sense of what I would call now a kind of hyper invisibility and hyper visibility at the same time. And so most Koreans hadn't actually come to the US until the mid 70s. And so we were a bit of an anomaly at that time. And so I spent most of my youth in Long Island and eventually went to high school in Connecticut and off to college.
So I'm curious really about what prompted you to write this memoir. You've written a couple of books before this, but this one's a bit more personal for you. So what was that thing that made you decide, yeah, I do need to write this?
That's a difficult question, and one that I'm sure that I'm going to have to answer to over and over again. I would say that there was something that was really important for my own sense of reckoning with my childhood and the ways in which I'm sort of conditioned today based on my past. And a few years ago, I sat in on a memoir workshop, and it was only for about an hour. And I decided that I was going to write this story about my childhood and growing up in Long Island with my family. And I wrote the whole thing and did nothing with it. Then I decided I would workshop it a little bit at some conferences and just began to tell the story about what it was like growing up in my family and around the culture of silence surrounding mental illness. And what I found was that people were so grateful that I actually said something about it. And so it seemed like it was a story that really caught the attention of other folks. And also it sort of told their story too. And so that's pretty much why I wrote it and why I had sent it out to publish. So my hope is that in writing it, that it would be helpful for other people. I know when I've read memoirs, they've been incredibly helpful for me, just sort of seeing the sort of process of deep suffering and then resilience, and that the resilience is never some magical rainbow at the end, of this journey, but just that it's possible to come to terms with your past.
Yeah. And there's so many different layers in the past that you had, and you speak very candidly about that in the book, about those hardships, even abuse that you suffered as a child. I'm wondering if you might share some of those circumstances, whatever it is that you're comfortable saying here, that you've wrestled with and how they impacted you growing up.
Yeah, there's so many layers to the book, as you say, and in many ways, so much of it intersects, being a Korean American second generation immigrant kid and growing up in this family where, my mom suffered from mental illness, but at that time, we didn't really talk about it. And I would say today in Asian American cultures, and we still don't talk about it. But at that particular time, nobody said anything about it. And so I lived this pretty isolated life in my house with my mom and my dad. And so I experienced a lot of abuse in relationship to my mother. And one of the interesting things about my mom was that she was undiagnosed anorexic and bulimic. And those are the things we never talk about. Mm-hmm. And so if you never talk about it, you sort of grow up thinking that this might actually be normal, or it might just be the way things are. And I didn't really know any other way. And so when I was growing up, my mom, she spent a lot of time just focused so much on really denying herself food. And on the other hand, also forcing me to eat. And what I talk about in the book in the first couple of chapters is that in Asian American cultures, it's very common for parents and grandparents to force their kids to eat as a kind of, it's a symbol of love. And at the same time, you have to eat even if you're not hungry because it's respect. And so there is that kind of cultural veneer, and at the same time, in that cultural logic, but my mom took it a little too far in that she actually really did force me to eat way beyond what I was comfortable with. And so I grew up not really knowing and learning how to figure out if I was hungry or not. And so I experienced quite a bit of suffering around food, around body image growing up, because it really was never my choice when I was in the house, sort of when I should eat, how much I should eat, or when I was done. So I was always looking to her to basically let me finish and let me be done. And so, that adds and leaves an imprint.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, and we'll come back to this later on in this conversation about how that's influenced your work on mindful eating, the next and very important thing that you're working on. But I want to stick with some of the other aspects of your growing up, and in particular, this idea of, as you mentioned, being an Asian American woman in a primarily white male dominated society in a time where there weren't a lot of, in particular, Korean Americans who'd come here yet. In particular, where you were growing up, was a very white area. And so I'm wondering how you may have responded to some of the attitudes you encountered. You mentioned being hyper visible and hyper invisible at the same time. What was that like for you?
Well, I definitely was on the receiving end of a lot of racist taunting when I was a kid. That was just everyday life, going to school and, being made fun of, or being called this or that. And so that was just everyday sort of regular life. And I think that, when I would come home, I remember distinctly complaining one day that I really wished that I wasn't Korean, because I just had this sense that maybe my life would be easier because I wouldn't be made fun of all the time for the way I looked. And so that was just a very common part of my experience growing up. And at the same time, I do think that, Korean Americans are and were very insular as well. And so perhaps in response to a lot of the social experiences of racism, there was a tendency to just stick together. And so all the kids I know were being made fun of at school, and then they come home, but then parents wouldn't really talk about it or really know what to do about it. And so there was this kind of silence around that, and the sense of, just work hard and, you'll be fine. And there wasn't a lot of opportunity to really discuss or process any of that. Parenting is very different now than it was in the 70s as well. So maybe that would have made a difference.
But it also brings in something that I wanted to ask about. I'm wondering if that contributed to an overall attitude of silence. You mentioned a silence around mental illness, a tendency to shame those who are suffering in some way. I'm wondering if you might share some of your views about, I think the apparent need for that to change and what might support that. And if perhaps just the silence in other aspects contributed to that overall silence.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of silence, I agree, around mental illness and really around anything that doesn't go well. And part of it does have to do with this immigrant experience of coming from a different country and establishing yourself and becoming a racial minority and not wanting people to really see your quote unquote mess. And I think in many ways, this is related to the model minority myth that surrounds Asian Americans. On the one hand, we want to combat it. On the other hand, we also want to embrace it. And so there's ways in which it works as a tool to help us make us feel better about ourselves. And on the other hand, it perpetuates a lot of the silence that surrounds mental illness and really any other kind of suffering, whether it's economic suffering, that we face. And so one of the things that was quite pervasive in my childhood was both a cultural silence, a silence in my household around what was going on, as well as the kind of silence I developed in response to any kind of struggle or any kind of stress or abuse, I just went silent myself. And so it's just so much silence, and not the good kind. And so, part of my reason for writing this book also was to let go of some of the shame that is a part of my childhood, and also a part of my family, and also part of the culture. And so, we're all intimately interconnected and tied together. And so the shame around talking about mental illness is something that I also absorbed. And so I wanted this book to be an opportunity to really lay bare the silence and the shame around mental illness, around body image. Asian American women in particular, I know that many of us experience this kind of trap where, on the one hand, we're supposed to eat what our elders give us, and on the other hand, you're supposed to stay physically small. There's this ideal that still gets played out in media and popular culture. And so a lot of times people are just in a bind. And I remember actually about maybe 8 years ago, I stumbled across this blog, and I think it was called thickdumplingskin.com. And it was organized by two Asian American women. And I stumbled onto the blog because I don't remember how I got there, but I was grateful that I did, because it was a blog that gave the opportunity for women, and Asian American women in particular, talk about the cultural pressures and the family pressures surrounding food. Because there is that myth that Asian Americans themselves buy into, that Asian women are supposed to be small, they're supposed to be thin, they're supposed to be petite. And if you're not, well, you're not a good daughter, you're an embarrassment to the family. So there's that. And then there's the pressure to eat. And so I think I don't know that it's unique to Asian Americans, but it's something that certainly is pervasive amongst many of Asian American cultures. And so this blog was fascinating because it gave an opportunity for folks to actually talk about it and just acknowledge what was happening and the struggles that mostly women at that time on the blog, mostly women were facing, both in their own families and then in the larger culture. And so that blog post, or that blog, was something that I had never come across that before. And it was such a relief. And actually, if I think about when I started thinking about this book, I think it was then.
And so it sounds like, well, a number of things. First, that there's a lot of challenging dichotomies here. Visibility, the invisibility, you need to eat, and you also need to stay small. There's the model Asian myth and how that all works. Juggling so many of these very different poles must have been really quite a challenge. And my understanding is you found some help with Buddhism. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that, how that's helped you, what that looks like for you.
Well, I think, I remember so clearly, and I write about this in the book, the moment when I first learned about Buddhism. I was in high school. I was in my AP Modern European History class, and my teacher invited his wife to give a lecture that day on Buddhism. And, she talked a lot about suffering and the Four Noble Truths. And it just blew me away, because I definitely had experienced a lot of suffering that I didn't think a lot of my friends had suffered in the same sorts of ways with their mother or culturally. And so my teacher's wife just gave me this incredible way of understanding reality and understanding my own kind of suffering. And one of the things that was really helpful and beneficial to me was this idea of impermanence, because I think that, like with many young women at the time, I was completely obsessed with what I looked like. And that preoccupation was also fueled by this struggle that I had growing up in my own household, where I was never pretty enough, I was too fat, according to my mother. And so I remember hearing about the words of, the Buddha, and talking about impermanence. And I thought, wow, like, it doesn't always have to be this way. And I didn't think that I was wise enough to make the mental connection there that my mind needed to change. But I think it was more that, oh, at some point I will look different, you know. But that was my young brain talking to me. But over time, you know, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me in terms of the logics of Buddhist Dharma, in terms of suffering and the end of suffering, and you know, three marks of existence. All those basic building blocks of Buddhism just made more sense to me than anything else ever had. So it was an exciting time, and I became very interested in learning more and sort of considering myself a philosophical Buddhist. And then that brought me straight to college. And my first professor was a former Tibetan Buddhist monk. And so that just set the wheel in motion. And it was either choosing between, you know, art history and being a fancy gallery owner in Soho, or Buddhist studies. And so it became Buddhist studies.
Thank you for telling that story. And it's interesting that as you were speaking and you've been mentioning this blog and how you would see things that would occasionally inspire you because of their openness. And certainly that's what you've done with this book, is sharing that openness. So here's hoping that this touches a listener in some way by your own sharing. And for those who might be listening that are suffering in some of the ways you've described, I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts about what they might do.
That's a wonderful question. I'm not so sure I'm great at telling people what I think that they should do, but I will say that there's things that I've done that have been really helpful. For me, I actually did a lot of embodied practice. And yeah, I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but as an academic, I tend to focus on the theory. But for myself, I began to feel a lot more comfortable in my own body and began to address a lot of the struggles that I've had when I actually became willing to do the kind of work that got me back into my body. So I actually took up, in addition to practicing meditation, I began to study yoga. And I didn't really understand what was happening when I would practice, but I just felt deeply in my body, and I learned how to appreciate it in the present in ways that I never had before. And, you know, we can always write about, you know, meditation and yoga is great for becoming present. And it sounds like something that it's a wonderful ideal. It's kind of abstract. It might sound almost a little bit fluffy, but the thing is that it actually works. So that was the thing for me that was the most helpful. It was sort of dropping out of my head and just into my body, and, you know, letting some of the mental chatter go. You know, and it was only later when I began to study trauma and trauma-informed yoga, and I, of course, put myself, therefore, you know, as an academic, I was like, well, I won't really understand this unless I study it. So then I trained and got my 200-hour registered yoga teacher certificate and began to study trauma, that I began to understand what was actually happening to my body when I practiced. So that's what's been most helpful for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And we've had other conversations on this podcast and another one I do around trauma and working with that, and that meditation practices are not always the right solution. They're not a cure-all. They're not a panacea. I have this conversation on a regular basis because it's often presented that way, and it's not. So thank you and others who make clear that, particularly those who are suffering from trauma or have PTSD or some other challenges like this, that just getting in touch with your body might be difficult. Taking a closer look at the thoughts might be difficult and can, in fact, be re-traumatizing. So thank you for your awareness and learning about that, and for sharing about that too.
Yeah, I don't even think I knew about, I never would have thought of myself as somebody that had experienced early childhood trauma. You know, I don't know what it was that I was unwilling to look at, but I knew all the things that had happened to me in the past, but somehow if I had labeled it trauma, it would mean that somehow I was broken, and I was unwilling to do that. And it really wasn't until I remember I actually went and talked to a therapist about this and sort of what was going on with me not too long ago, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And she looked at me and she said, Sharon, your childhood was really brutal. And it was such a shock to me to have that reflected back to me, because I never would talk about my childhood in that way or understand it as, early childhood trauma. But this is why I love memoirs. I was reading a memoir, The Hillbilly Elegy, and in it, the author, I can't remember his name right now, but he had referenced the ACE test for childhood, was the accumulated childhood experiences. And there was a scale between like 1 and 10. If you experience this, you get a point. If you experience this, you get a point. And anything, above a 2 was considered something that would perhaps make you more susceptible to illness, chronic illness when you grew up. And so I was going through the list and I was like, I'll just take this and see what happens. And I think I scored a 4. And it was sort of this objective measure of suffering that I had never really allowed myself to even think about. And all I could think of, like, who in the world is going to get a 0, right? And so then I actually sent this test over to my then fiance. This wasn't that long ago. And I was like, can you imagine someone getting a 0? I mean, really? And he took it and I said, what's your score? And he said 0. So that was an eye opener for me.
Now, I'm curious. That makes me wonder about when you were younger, because this is a different way of looking at your childhood, that it was brutal. When you were younger, did you have a sense that other kids have different kinds of experiences that are not like the ones you're having? Or was it just so insular that this was just normal and it wasn't considered to be something that was bad or wrong in some way?
Yeah, no, I knew. I think that I was really quite aware, and I felt like I was pretty grown up at a pretty early age. And I knew that things that were happening to me in my household were fairly unique to me, and that most of the kids that I knew at school probably didn't go through the kinds of things that I did. But then again, who knows, because we don't really talk about it. Yeah. But I would say I knew very early on that there were things that were going on that were not normal. But the silence was what was normal for me. There was never a sense that I would mention it to anybody else. I just remember very often wishing that somebody would just be able to read my mind and know what was going on in my life, and then come in and intervene or do something. But yeah, the experiences of abuse and emotional abuse and physical, those I was very clear, this is not okay. But the silence, that was normal to me.
I'd like to shift to work that you're doing right now, and we're coming back to this on mindful eating. And I'm wondering if you might say more about that. I mean, from your background, this is something you've had experience with your whole life, and various illnesses around eating. I wonder if you could say something about that work that you're doing now.
Sure. So everything for me is usually prompted by a book, like the discovery of a book, right? And it's a great way to start conversations, especially with other folks that are into books. But I was, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, was in Barnes and Noble and just having a lousy day. So like, what do they have in Buddhism here, But I found myself actually, I think it was in self-help. And that's the aisle of the bookstore that most academics are embarrassed to be found in, right? Because nothing's wrong with us. We're too brainy to have any problems. Absolutely not true. But I was in the self-help section and I came across this book literally titled Mindful Eating. And it was written by Jan Chozen Bays. And I was struggling at the time, and just with how I felt in my body and just feeling really uncomfortable. And so I picked up this book, and it was the first book that I'd ever read that really applied principles in Buddha Dharma to eating and the struggles that many of us face, and past conditioning and family conditioning. And I remember I picked up this book and I just devoured it. And I think when I brought it home and I read it, I probably just cried out of relief that there was a book that kind of understood what I had been struggling with since I was a child, and offering very basic techniques for learning how to tune into your own internal cues. The premise for mindful eating is that, we spend so much time really held hostage by popular culture, the diet and wellness industry, what it's like $60 billion a year pumped into this industry, telling us what we should or shouldn't eat. And mindful eating and Jan Chosen Base comes along in this very simple format and says, there's an alternative way. And that way is just to tune in. And so that was an incredible game changer for me. And I don't know if it's because I'm an academic or what it is, but I just love to take trainings and workshops and this and that, because if I'm going to learn something, I'm not going to learn it just by reading about it. So I need to dive 100% in. And so I actually took a training with Jan Chosen Bays and Shar Wilkins in mindful eating, conscious living through UCSD's School Center for Mindfulness. And so I went down to Great Vow Monastery and did this training with them on how to facilitate and teach mindful eating. And for me, the way I was going to learn it was by figuring out how to teach it. So I did the training about 2 years ago, and I'm actually going next month to finish it off. So I did my level 1 certification and finish it off next month at Great Vow, level 2 certification. And I started teaching both in the Seattle area and on campus, because I began to realize that there was a really powerful, potent message here in terms of just tuning out all the excess noise. And I've never asked myself, and this is one of the exercises in mindful eating, is to ask yourself, number one, how hungry you are. Number two, how much would you like to eat? And are you satisfied? Like, these really simple questions are so profound, because we give up our ability to make these decisions. And it's so tricky and insidious. So I taught my first cohort that I taught was actually a group of women of color faculty at Seattle University. And I wanted to create a space for women of color. And I thought, well, this might be an interesting way just to learn how to teach this and to get some experience. And so I taught my first 8-week course about 1.5 years ago, and since then have been offering it probably every quarter or at least twice a year.
And what's that been like? What has the response been from the community having this available to them?
It's been wonderful. Most of the folks that I've worked with, they're so hard on themselves, and they think they're supposed to be hard on themselves all the time. And I think a lot of times people don't have an opportunity to even imagine feeding themselves in a way that is nourishing and kind. And if they happen to eat to go unconscious, like, people like to bring their guilt to me. And I would say, I don't think Buddhists are really that into guilt, but they like to tell me the things that they eat, and they think that I'm going to judge them for it and give them a prescription of how to eat. And I always have to remind them that, I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not here to offer any kind of diet plan. I'm not here to offer any kind of exercise plan, but I'm here to facilitate this practice of learning how to have a more joyful relationship to food. And I think sometimes people are expecting, they might sign up because they're expecting somehow this like magical Buddhist diet plan. And then on the first day, I have to divest them of that, and I say, there's no talk of nutrition here at all. There's no eat this, don't eat this list. It's eat what you want. And if you're eating to go unconscious, well, isn't that interesting? Let's take a look at that. It's been great.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners about really anything we've talked about today?
Well, besides the shameless plug for the book, I will share that, this is a book that on the one hand is something that I'm really proud of. And on the other hand, it's very frightening to put yourself out there. And the very reason why I wanted to do it, which was to break open the silence and the culture of shame, are also the very reasons why I'm really afraid of, having people know so much about my life. So there's that sense of, on the one hand, wanting to break down this culture of silence, and the silence that I think in many ways has us perpetuating this model minority myth. Like, we're all fine, we're all doing really well, we're all really successful. And I wanted to really break that down, but that myth has a way of sort of seeping into the cracks of my mind. Like, wait a minute, everyone's going to know, that it wasn't perfect, and that it wasn't so easy, and it wasn't so naturally that you would just, be able to accomplish all of these things. And so there's a cycle here of that myth that I want to break, but it still traps me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And for those who are interested, I'm going to have several links on the episode page for this episode, including to all the books. Our guest today, Sharon Sue. Sharon, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.